Thanks a lot, Matt. And I'm going to talk for the next hour about some early season snow, and we'll discuss why is this important to pay attention here in the fall at the very start of the season, and also how the weather can affect the future problems with this. Like what happens to this early season snow as we move forward into the winter. But before I start, I'd like to thank Uphill Pursuits for hosting this. They're a great partner with us and the Friends of the Avalanche Center. I also want to give a big shout out to the Friends of the Avalanche Center because they are our main partners and they help fund our operation, and we could not do the job we do without them. So let's start here. When we look at avalanche fatalities, as this pie chart shows, 25% of the people that die are from trauma. The other 75% suffocate. Sometimes it's a combination of both. With the 25% that are traumatized, a lot of times it's head injuries. We see this more. We see fatalities happening in the fall that have to do with trauma because the snowpack is so thin. So right now is a good idea to be wearing a helmet, taking precautions, because there are a lot of obstacles out there that can definitely injure or potentially kill us. There's going to be, when you tip over, you stand an excellent chance of hitting rocks or logs. And so that is one of the primary factors that we find in avalanche fatalities, certainly in the early season, but in general, about 25%. This lends itself to protective gear. We always say carry a beacon, a shovel, and a probe, but with 25% of the time trauma, a lot of times that's head trauma, certainly wearing a helmet is a good idea as well. Now, as the snow gets deeper, and especially if we're dealing with what we call deep slab avalanches, slabs that break, 3, 4, 5, 10 feet deep, that is where asphyxiation really comes in, because you can be buried deeply. And something you can do to help with that are products like Avalanche, or airbags can keep you near the surface, if not on top of the surface. So those things certainly help with getting to you fast so you don't die from asphyxiation. In 2000 and hold on one second here, 2015, there were some hunters at Sacagawea Bowl. This is a Google image of Sacagawea Bowl. So it was early in the season. In fact, it was today, 5 years ago, 2 hunters were crossing the slope and they approached where the top of that black line is, but it had snowed. And there was about a foot and a half of snow on the ground, and they hit a wind drift. And when they hit a wind drift, it caused the slope to fracture, and they tumbled 400 feet all the way down to the bottom. One of them was injured. They were not buried, but they were able to, hike out and get help. It broke about 20 feet wide, and it broke about 30 feet or so above them. So small avalanche. They were not preparing for it. They didn't have any gear or anything like that. Thankfully, they were not completely buried. But this is one of these small avalanches that can have big consequences, and luckily they were able to walk away. So hunters are not immune to avalanches this time of year. Trying to get my slide to move here. It's not working. Okay, sorry about that, technical difficulties. Another early season accident that happened was on the Sphinx, which is in the northern Madison Range. And in 2004, 2 ice climbers came up to do this really nice moderate 3-pitch climb, and they got swept to their deaths in an avalanche. And it was an early season, very thin snowpack. This is a picture looking, the way it works is you're approaching from down on the left, and you hike up to the saddle with the trees, and then you start walking towards the camera. That's the helmet in the background. And you can see from this picture, I mean, there's hardly any snow on the ground, and certainly you're not thinking about avalanches. There's not enough snow. But as soon as you round the corner onto the north face where the ice climb is, this is what it looks like. And this is very close to the spot where they were swept away and killed in 2004. And they're crossing all these little benches and all these little pockets. And there was 3 of them. And one guy stopped to tie his shoe while the other 2 kept walking. And when he was done tying his shoe, he walked out to see where his friends went, and their footsteps disappeared into a very small avalanche. It was only about 12 inches deep, but it pushed them and knocked them over. And right below where this photo was taken is a 100-foot cliff. So it's incredibly unforgiving terrain. So in the early season, we're not necessarily tuned into avalanches, as we saw in that previous picture. The snowpack is barely layered. It might only have 1 or 2 layers on it. So we're not even really thinking a lot of times that something could slide, but it can. Anytime we have enough snow on the ground to ski, or we're post-holing through, chances are it could slide if it's weak enough. And in their case, unfortunately, even though it was a tiny slide, it was enough to tip them over, and it took them into a terrain trap, and they were killed. So it's just a heads up in these early seasons on these very exposed slopes. Imp Peak. Imp Peak is in the southern Madison Range. And in 2017, a young Bozeman woman, Inga Perkins, was killed on this slope. And as you can see, this is looking down. These are the 3 rescuers or searchers on the debris field. And beyond them, you can see how thin the snowpack is. In fact, this is right after the second storm of the year right here. And you know, we had about a few feet of snow. The wind blew. The snowpack was in fact layered. And so her and her boyfriend hiked up from the car to try and climb Imp Peak, which has a beautiful core on it. And as they were, when they hit the snow line, they put their skis on, and they were skinning uphill. And as they were skinning uphill together, the best skinning happens to be where the wind lows are. And we change slides here, and we can see in the photo, the upper red line is the crown line. That's where it broke. We can see where she ended up getting buried, and her partner was down, buried to his chest down below. Now, in the early season, when you're skinning up, I mean, this is the case right now. If you were to go to Frazier Lake, or you're going to go to Beehive, or places in the Bridgers, as you're skinning up, you're going to naturally stay to where the snow is deepest, because that's the easiest skinning. You just have to be extra aware that that is also where the wind loads are. That's also where you're gonna, if there's any instability, that is where an avalanche can happen. And so as they were skinning up, one of them triggered the slope. It broke anywhere from like 1 to 3 feet deep, came down very small. I mean, the whole slide itself was, you know, less than 150 feet vertical. But they didn't have their avalanche transceivers on and beeping. So they had brought them. It was in their packs because they had planned, or we surmised they were going to put them on a little higher up when they actually got into the couloir, but it wasn't. No one was beeping, and so when Inga was buried, it was near impossible to find her. And so the partner dug himself out, got his probe out, and probed frantically for a few hours, and couldn't get her. So when we look back at this and we go, well, you know, what are some real lessons here? You know, some real lessons here are, you have, if you're clicking into your skis and you're skinning uphill, it's probably a good idea to put your beacon on and to actually turn it on. It's just a good practice that could have made a difference. The second is as you're skinning up, you're going to pass through potentially these really small terrain features. And these terrain features are avalanche terrain. Sometimes it's hard to picture that, like, oh, there's no way this is going to slide. It's just too small, but it can. And small avalanches are deadly because they're either going to take you somewhere you don't want to go, like off a cliff or into a creek, or if you're alone or you don't have the gear, they can bury you and no one's going to be able to find you. When we look here, this is looking up the slope from where the avalanche happened. You can see just just looking at this picture, you can notice a few things. One is how thin the snow cover is. All these rocks are sticking out. And you can also see the debris. The debris is very angular. It's very chunky. And what that's telling us is that it's a hard, we call it a hard slab. It's wind loaded snow. And so in this case, the slope was loaded from the wind and made these hard slabs. And so when it broke, all the way towards the ground and was enough to bury Inga about close to 3 feet under the snow surface. So again, these, I want to, kind of just drill home that small doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. Small slopes can slide and small slopes can kill you. And in the early season, thin snow means you'll naturally probably gravitate to the wind-loaded areas, which are also the more dangerous. There was an avalanche accident that happened in 2012, December. This was October 27th, so this was really early. This was south of Frazier Lake. Some people were injured, but no one was killed, thank God. And in this photo, behind the words uphill skin track, you can make out the little zigzag of the skin track. And you can also see to the left of the skin track the debris that came down, and from the slide in the crown. And so the story here is there was one man who was a solo skier, and he was just heading up the Frazier Lake Road for some exercise. He gets picked, bumps into 2 other guys that are in a car, and they decide to, join forces and they'll all ski together. And so this is like a new partnership. And they ski in and they set this track, and they're sort of close together as they're breaking trail up, and they get up towards the crown there. And what happens is they get a huge whoomp. And as soon as the whoomp happened, it broke about 80 feet above them. The avalanche started to pull away. The crown line formed about 80 feet above them, and it went 3 feet deep. Now, one of them had an Avalanche, which is like the little snorkel that you can put in your mouth and it lets you breathe under the snow. He had it out. He grabbed it, tried to get it in his mouth, but he couldn't do it before he was swept away. So you've got 3 skiers that are now swept downhill in this avalanche. Just like the accident on Imp Peak, they're in tour mode. So they've got skins on, their heels are free. They're not necessarily ready for, an avalanche. And they're swept downhill, and all 3 of them are partially buried. One of them is face down in the snow, arms extended, and is having a hard time breathing. The second guy is almost completely buried, but he has a hand out of the snow, and he's able to kind of like make a little bit of a pocket so he can breathe. And the third guy is buried. He has telemark skis on. He's still attached to the skis. He can't release them, and he's buried to near his chest. He's able to dig with his hands, get his pack off, get his shovel out, and dig to get his skis out so he could release his bindings and then he went downhill and was able to dig out his two partners. One of them was injured, not seriously, and they were able to kind of walk and hobble out. You can see in this photo, the three skiers were hiking out. The arrow shows on that south-facing slope where the slide came down. Now, what was interesting and kind of a happy ending with this is, no one died. So we were able, during the interview process, we were really able to talk with them and find out, like, well, what happened? What were you thinking? What would you do differently? And they, one of the things that came out was, well, a few things came out. One of the ones that struck with me was they said, my God, like, it was October and they were, they just wanted to kind of stretch their legs. They weren't thinking about avalanches. They were just thinking like, oh, this will be great to get outside and, get a little exercise. But then the conditions weren't bad and they thought, oh, we'll just kind of head up and get a few turns in. And so, their kind of avalanche brains weren't tuned in yet. Another thing was one of the guys had a helmet on, but because they were skinning uphill, it was hot out and he didn't fasten it. So it wasn't clipped under his chin. And so when the avalanche happened, it just, the helmet obviously didn't do him any good. One of the guys had an airbag that he would always carry religiously in the winter. But because this was his first day out, he thought, I don't need an airbag. I'm just going to tour on up in the, towards Frazier Basin. And so he left that at home. And then, they had 3 people at a time on the slope. And so, one of the mantras that we always say is, you have to ski one at a time. You want to only put one person at a time in avalanche terrain. And the reason for that is if there's an avalanche, we always need someone outside the avalanche to come rescue us because we make mistakes. In this case, luckily, one person was able to get a shovel out and dig himself out, because the grim reality is if he couldn't have got himself out, or if he was completely buried, even though the other 3 were uninjured, they were not able to get themselves out, and they likely would have just froze to death up there. Because no one knew where they were, and they wouldn't have survived the night buried in the snow like that. So it's just a good reminder that we always want to be extra careful. You want to be skinning from safe spot to safe spot. You want to be really sharp about it. Another point they made, which I think is a really good one, has to do with communication, because they weren't each other's regular partners. They did not have kind of a way to communicate. They just made some basic assumptions about how they were traveling, and that they didn't really talk about much with the snow as they were going up. And so when they're, it just brought home that if we're with new people, or, we haven't done this before with a new partner, you really want to take the time to communicate about, hey, let's start here. Let's regroup over here. What do you think's happening with the snow? Are we feeling okay with it? Just some simple things can make a huge difference, because in their case, they got the whump, and unfortunately, instead of it just staying a whump, they were on a steep enough slope that it turned into an avalanche. So happy ending. The injuries ended up being fine, but it was a really, really close call in the early season. So that is kind of the big early season kind of take home points. Treat the snow like you would as if it was January. You want to do everything you would normally do. You want to carry all your rescue gear. You want to go one at a time. And you have to be aware that you're probably not as sharp now at the beginning of the season as you were last year at the end of the season. So just give yourself a little room to, you need some wiggle room, mental wiggle room to make good decisions. What I'd like to do now is take a few minutes to take some questions. And then after that, we're going to move into more the science portion, at least in terms of talking about faceting with early season snow. So, Matt, let's see, do we have some questions? If so, pop them into the chat box. Okay, we've got a question here. How effective are airbags? Airbags are very effective. When an airbag, when they look at the stats of people that have been buried with airbags or deployed airbags in avalanches, I believe it's something like your survival rate goes up something like 15%, which which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually quite a lot. If you're looking at dying to get an extra 15%, you're looking pretty good. Another thing that airbags do is part of the reason people die is when you're buried in the snow. Remember, 75% were asphyxiation. And so in order to not die of asphyxiation, you need a partner to come and get you out. And so an airbag will either keep you at the surface so they don't have to do a beacon search, because if they see the kind of the red airbag sticking out of the snow, they can come right to you and dig you out. Or if you are completely buried, especially if it's a big avalanche, chances are you will be closer to the surface, which means your partners will be able to get to you quicker. So yes, airbags are very effective. We got another question here. It says, are early season layers primarily formed in wind-loaded areas as opposed to the first couple protected layers of snow? And have you seen merely a few layers of snow slide to the ground early in the season? So the answer is a little bit of yes on both those. So wind-loaded areas early season are one of our primary concerns because that's where the snow is. So once the snow gets deep enough to where it's covering the rocks, now we're starting to get layers in the snowpack. And the layers, all it means is there's multiple snowstorms. So every time it snows, it forms a new layer. So here we are right now, we're going to be a few snowstorms in, so there's a few layers that we're looking at, and so we're interested in how those layers are sticking and bonding together. And even with a handful of layers in the snow, things can still break right at the ground. Someone asked a question of what are my thoughts on Avalanche. Avalanche is the little snorkel device that Black Diamond makes or used to make, and you could put it in your mouth and it allows you to breathe while you're buried. They're hard to come by now because they don't make them anymore. So, but I have one. I actually use it a lot. I carry it with me. I like them. I also have an airbag as well. So he says another question is, can you speak about the recent early season accident on the Great One? This last few days ago, a young woman was skiing the Great One in the Bridger Range. The Great One is about a 1,500-foot couloir, beautiful ski run in the Bridgers. It holds snow, and so it had some snow in it. But my understanding is it was very kind of hard pack, and the skier fell and died of trauma. And so it's an example where maybe midwinter you would have just slid down and taken a nice ride, but that same fall this time of year means you're going to crash in the rocks because there's so many rocks everywhere. So incredibly tragic. And you know, it's just, you know, with any accident, I mean, we just want to look at it and see, well, you know, what can we learn from this? And, you know, what you learn is, you know, early season can be no fall terrain and you have to watch out for obstacles. Let's see. I assume there's an ice layer has formed with all this warm weather. Will this be a stabilizing feature or provide a surface for avalanches to break on later this season? And so there may be an ice layer. It's certainly been warm down low. I mean, I know up higher on certainly north-facing slopes, it may not have gotten warm enough to form an ice layer. We'll just have to, the ice layer becomes a bit of a wait and see. Just because there's an ice layer doesn't mean that snow can't stick to it well. So we're just going to have to certainly wait and see. You know, this time of year, though, every storm can create some quick instabilities because the snowpack is so thin that, we're really adding a lot of weight relative to what's on the ground. So it has a harder time kind of, holding that snow. And we see a lot of wind loads breaking in gullies and near the ridge tops this time of year. So anyway, it's hard to say what happened. It's, with the warm weather we had last week, the general rule of thumb is early season snow is rarely good, for later on in the year. It usually gets weaker as time goes on. Sometimes it doesn't, but being somewhat of a pessimist, I'm kind of bracing myself for this early season snow to get weaker. I think I'd like to move into the next session. And then after that, we will answer some more questions. So Matt, you're going to show a video here for me. And we have really cold temperatures. Faceting can happen very quickly. And the reason for that is that in order to create faceting, we need what's called a temperature gradient in the snowpack. It needs to be a large temperature difference. And the ground is pretty much always 0 degrees Celsius. So we have 0 degrees Celsius at the ground. I have a thermometer and I measured the snow surface temperature, and here it was minus 17. So in 45 centimeters, we had a 17-degree difference, which is quite large. Now what happens is the snow here isn't very dense. There's a lot of air in the snow. And that air in the snow is saturated. It's 100% humidity. It means it's full of water molecules. What water vapor will do is it migrates through the snowpack as it moves from warmer areas to colder areas. So down at the ground, the water vapor is slowly moving up through the snowpack. When water vapor moves, it's only moving from one snow crystal to another snow crystal. And when it moves to that other snow crystal and refreezes, it freezes in this ice crystal, which is incredibly angular. So as the water vapor is moving from crystal to crystal, what's driving that process is this temperature difference. Now, there's a threshold, the minimum threshold for this to happen, and that is 1 degree Celsius per 10 centimeters. Since we have 45 centimeters here, that's 4.5 degrees Celsius we would need difference in order to see faceting. We have 17. So we have almost 4 times the amount of temperature gradient needed to drive this process and create facets. And that's why here we're seeing lots of facets and we're seeing them grow incredibly quickly. Thanks for showing that, Matt. Okay, I want to comment a little bit on that video. So first off, faceted snow is weak snow. When snow becomes angular, when it becomes, they become big crystals, they have really sharp edges to them, it means that they don't bond well, they don't stick to each other well. If you grab a handful of that snow, like in the video, you can't make a snowball with it. It just falls out. It's the equivalent, different terms we'll use is we'll say, oh, it's like sugar, it's sugar snow, because it's like reaching into a sugar jar and it just falls through your fingers. Or if you reached in to a bowl of rice, it's the same kind of thing. And so it's really weak. And so in the early season, besides the dangers associated with thin snowpacks and hitting rocks and being traumatized, we're also really kind of worried and queued up about the snow that fell on the ground becoming weaker. Because what we need to think of here is all the snow, like when we're looking up at the mountains on Monday, we'll say, let's say it snows this weekend, and we wake up on Monday and it's a sunny, nice day, and we look out at the mountains and they're just blanketed in white. Well, as soon as they're blanketed in white like that, I start to think, I wonder if that snow is going to get stronger or weaker. Well, if we have a temperature gradient, like I described in that video, in the snowpack, which we almost always will early season, that snow will become weak. And that snow now is the foundation for our entire winter's snowpack. So you can picture if it's going to snow, like if we're going to put 7 feet of snow up there, through the winter, it's going to be sitting on potentially something really weak. I mean, it's no different than if you were in construction and you built the foundation for your house and you used really bad cement and it was all crumbly. I mean, you're probably not psyched to put a 3-4 story, building on it because it's not going to make it. And the snowpack is the same way. And that's why in our advisories and in our videos, you'll hear us talk so much, especially early season, about these facets forming. So when these facets get very big, we call them depth hoar. So if you hear the term depth hoar, we're just talking about really big crystals. When you grab them, they're just really big and sugary, and but the term facet typically means weak snow. Now, this picture here is a picture of Crown Butte. At the bottom of the photo is a hole. That is the hole where a young teenage boy was buried. He was on a snowmobile and was buried here and killed. This happened in 2014 in March. So earlier on, we were looking at all those accidents that were happening in October, November. Now you can imagine putting feet and feet of snow on top of some of those weak layers, and come March of 2014, we had a buried weak layer and we had some sizable storms. The day this accident happened, it had snowed so much, it snowed, I think, like 4 or 5 feet. We had an avalanche warning out. A group of snowmobilers went out to Crown Butte. Multiple people were on this slope. When one of them triggered the slide, he was high on the slope and caught a few folks. One of them was buried and unfortunately killed. This is the upper part of the slope here. Now, what's interesting, what catches my eye here is you can see the ground. You can see the dirt, you can see all the rocks there. So we know that this avalanche broke on those facets at the ground. And you say, well, those facets formed back in November and December. So they formed 3 to 4 months, 4.5 months before this avalanche happened. So that's why we start paying attention to the early season snowpack, is because we get what happens now will cause us worry later down the line. Now, to give scale here, the crown line and the left part of that crown and the left side of that crown was 4 to 5 feet deep. So this was a pretty sizable crown. You can also see all these rock outcroppings sticking out. These little, some of them are just huge boulders. And the slope was triggered from one of those spots. Because as you can imagine, if the snowpack is 7, 8, 9, 10 feet deep, if you have a weak layer at the ground, you can't, the weight of you, whether you're skiing or you're on your snowmobile, your weight cannot affect that weak layer. It won't break the bonds on that snow that deeply. But if you get close to a rock outcropping, or you get to a spot that's thin, and a thin spot might be an area where the wind blew, where it kind of scoured a little bit. On those thinner areas, well, now you can affect that weak layer. And if you get it to break, if you get those facets to break, they'll propagate. They just spread out as far as they can across that slope, and they'll be underneath some really thick slabs of snow, and you'll get huge avalanches. This is up near the crown line of this, where we dug. Where we dug the pit was, we had 3 feet of a dense slab of snow, and it was sitting on 5 inches of weak depth hoar, also called sugar snow. It's just that really loose, angular, granular snow, and it broke on that, and the avalanche was quite large. This is what those crystals look like. They're very well developed. They're very angular. They do not stick to one another. They actually have a bit of a cup shape to them, and this was just taken with a camera on a hand lens. Like if you can grab these, and if you can see this with the naked eye. You don't need a microscope or a hand lens or anything to see these little stripes and striations on the snow crystals. And so when we talk about faceted snow, this is exactly what we're talking about. These are weak, they're persistent, they'll last for months. I mean, they're going to form here. I mean, I can pretty much guarantee we're going to start to see some facets forming. And, here it is in beginning of November, and they may hang out for 3 or 4 months until they get enough weight on them that they break. So when you dig and you find the sugar snow, take a good look at it. They're not only beautiful, they're just kind of fun to track, because this is where the problem is. I'd be remiss if I did not talk about Saddle Peak. Saddle Peak is the peak to the south of Bridger Bowl. And if you ride the Schlossman's lift, you are free to go out of bounds and head on off to the peak, which is behind these skiers here. You can hike or skin up to the top and ski Saddle Peak, and then come back to the ski area. Now, Saddle Peak is a very large peak, and we have seen quite a number of avalanches there. There's been fatality, there's been a lot of near misses, there's been people injured, and this area is a little scary because it sees so much traffic. This picture was taken in 2010. So the boundary opened in 2008 is when Bridger opened up their boundaries. 2 years later, and this is February 2010, piece of cornice broke. Someone was walking near the edge. The cornice broke, tumbled down the hill, and triggered this huge avalanche. You can see the helicopter in the air. We did a big search because we were unclear if anyone had been caught. A slide of this size would be pretty much guaranteed you wouldn't survive it. You can also see with the crown line, if you have skied up there, it also took out some of the zones that you might think were so-called safe zones. But the setup for this was very similar to what we might have this year, but we certainly had in 2010, 2014, 2017, where we had early season snow. It faceted, then it just started snowing, just started being winter and snow and wind, and we're building slabs and we're just burying these facets just deeper and deeper and deeper in the snowpack. And people tend to think that, well, Saddle Peak, I mean, look at all that has a lot of tracks on it. Like, like surely those tracks would have beaten up that weak layer or made it stronger. And the answer is no, that's not what happened, because it was so deep in the pack, it was so near the ground that the ski tracks did not affect or break up that layer at all. The same went with that previous story of the avalanche on Crown Butte. Even though there was probably hundreds of tracks on that slope, it didn't matter. So tracks are not a sign of stability. And that's really important to remember on a place like Saddle Peak, where there will literally be hundreds and hundreds of tracks. I can tell you that hundreds of tracks got wiped out when this avalanche happened. So we had early season snow, we had faceted growth near the ground, and then it's just a matter of loading it and adding more and more weight. It's kind of like, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And this storm that happened in February put enough weight on that slope to where finally the foundation, the facets of the ground couldn't hold it anymore, and it broke in a huge avalanche. So skiing Saddle Peak is fun. I do it, I enjoy it, but avalanches are all about timing. And so with early season snow like we're having this year, What happens sometimes is if that layer forms poorly and gets weak, as the season goes on, you'll find in our language, if you read our advisories, which I recommend, we're kind of nervous because we're always worried about that weak layer at the ground breaking because we're never quite sure like what it's going to take. We're making, educated guesses, but we're just ourselves are always concerned about it, and we talk about it, and you have to dig and try and find it if you can. So enjoy saddle, but be careful. Last year, the date's wrong on this. This is totally wrong. This is Henderson Mountain, Cook City, but the date was last January. So it was January 2020. That's me standing under the largest crown I had ever been under. It was a little over 15 feet, and a snowmobiler triggered this the day before. And when you look at this, there's a few things we know. That's wind loaded. That is a hard wind slab there. It was sitting on weak faceted snow right near the ground. And we know that if the snowmobile was on top of the thickest part of that, he probably wouldn't have been able to trigger it. He triggered it from a much thinner area. And so this is a kind of a wide little panorama shot. It's the same crown that I was standing at. I was standing right above where the person on the slope is there. But the avalanche was triggered way to the right in those little pecker trees. And the snowpack there, it went from 1 foot to 15 feet deep. So it's just crazy how quickly that area was loaded. And so when the snowmobiler triggered or got that weak layer of facets to break and propagate, that fracture propagated out of the thin area where he was and just went right over to this huge 15-foot wind whale of a slope, and it broke. And luckily, he was caught, but he was fine. He was in the thinner part of the area, but this is a very steep slope, very wind loaded. So the lesson here is that for these later in the season, if we're going to get avalanches that are breaking at the ground, your best chance of getting something to fracture is at the thinnest parts of the slope. So there is some, good ideas if you're going to areas that you know well, that you go to frequently, and you start to learn, like, well, where are the thin spots? Like, where does the wind blow? Where does it strip the snow? Where does it put the snow? Those are kind of key things as you're kind of tooling around in the backcountry. So when we look at these more deep slabs that are formed from these early season facets that form, typically they're triggered from thin, rocky areas, not thick ones. Many times the snow is too deep to test at the ground. That means, a great example is Cook City, just because Cook City, the snow is just insanely deep there sometimes. You're looking at 12 feet of snow on the ground. You're not going to dig a hole 12 feet deep every time just to see if the layer's there. So what we do is we just, if we're tracking it, we know it's there in December and we know it's there in January, we're going to start saying, yeah, I bet it's still there in February and March too. And so as it starts getting loaded, we start to really get worried and wonder what it's going to take to get something like that to break. And chances are from that first bullet point, you're going to trigger it from somewhere thin and rocky. Deep avalanches tend to propagate far and wide. They're rarely small. They're usually not survivable. And the reason they're not survivable is because they bury you deep. And if you're buried in an avalanche, you've got about an 80% chance of survival if you're dug up in 10 minutes. If you're dug up in 20 minutes, you're now close to 50-50. You're in that coin toss territory of being able to survive. When you hit a half an hour, you're down around 30% of survival. So 30% is not good. Yet the only way someone's going to get to you within those first 10 minutes is if you have a really sharp partner who's fit, who knows what he's doing. He knows how to use a beacon, and he can dig a big hole really fast. And that's why these large avalanches can tend to be extra deadly. The problem is that you don't always know if you're on a thin or thick part of the slope until it's too late. Sometimes as you're skiing or you're sledding, you think it all looks uniform from the bottom. It all looks like one big, steady, pool table of great powder. But that's not at all what's going on underneath the snow surface, and you can trigger it from a thin spot. And again, tracks do not mean the slope is stable. And, that's why, it's a hard one to grasp to, what am I trying to say? When you're in the field and you see a slope with a ton of tracks on it, I mean, yeah, sure, that's better than if there were no tracks on it, but you would be incorrect to think that that slope could not slide simply because there's tracks on it. Because in order to get it to slide, you need a trigger to hit the spot in just the right spot. Sometimes there's a lot of right spots. Sometimes there's only a few right spots. But if they hit it in that spot and they get a fracture to propagate, now you got an avalanche. So tracks, people get fooled by tracks all the time. Don't let it be you. And I really recommend that you take an avalanche class. You learn about how to identify avalanche terrain, because in those smaller slides that we saw earlier with the hunters, with the avalanche on Imp Peak, and also the people on Sphinx, is they didn't necessarily realize they were in avalanche terrain. We tend to think avalanche terrain, these big open slopes, but these small slopes can be really, really deadly. An avalanche class will help you identify slopes, and it'll also teach you what to look for in the snow, because in order to be safe, I mean, you want to read the avalanche forecast. You want to go up when you're outside. You want to be traveling one at a time. You want to have your rescue gear. You want to know how to use it. And I really recommend that you know what's under your feet, because if you're going to trigger an avalanche, it's all happening under your feet. And so it's probably a good idea to take your shovel, put it in the snow, see what's under your feet, maybe do a stability test or two before you commit to avalanche terrain. So that's all I have right now. We will go to questions here. And yeah, thanks a lot. And if I don't get to, I'm not sure if I'll get to everyone's question, but we'll do the best we can here. Thanks for attending. And I'm going to make a plug here. mtavalanche.com, that's our website. We're Forest Service. This is tax dollars at work. It's a free service for you. Go and get the daily avalanche advisory. You can go to the website, subscribe. Right on the advisory page, you can click the subscribe button. It'll come to your inbox every day by 7:30. Every afternoon when we come back from the field, we'll post to Facebook and Instagram, usually with a video, if not a few photos, on what we saw that day to help you with your trip planning the next day. And our website has a lot of information about where it snowed, how much it snowed, pictures, videos. So get used to kind of surfing around that, and please sign up. And also send us emails with your observations, because we love getting information from folks that are out recreating. So thanks a lot. And Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Big thanks, Doug, for taking time this evening and talking. It looks like we do have one question there. Let's see if we got a couple minutes. It looks like some of the lower elevation or south facing areas are melting completely to the ground. Do you think it will be likely that buried facets will be found in very specific areas this year?
Okay, so what the question is, on areas where it's melted, we had snow 2 weeks ago, now it's dirt. Do we think there'll be buried facets there? And my answer is yeah, because that was so early season that I think the next snowfall, or if not the next one, the one after the next one, soon we're going to have snow on the ground everywhere, blanketing everywhere. And chances are a lot of it's going to start to facet. Certainly the north aspects up high may hold the facets a little more, but I think in general, it's still early. It's supposed to get cold. Early, snow in October, snow in November leads to many times faceting at the ground. There's a question here about where there'll be more free seminars like this one, and the answer is yes. We're going to be doing these all through the year, and so are other folks. There's a few private, private companies that are doing it as well, and we list them all on our education page on our website. We actually have a calendar on our homepage as well. So if you just go to mtavalanche.com, you can just scroll through and see when the next one is. But their town has I have to say, Bozeman has a lot of Avalanche education going for it, not just from us, but from all these different guide services and providers, Avalanche schools. So please take advantage of it. You won't be sorry. Let's see other questions. Let's see.
Yeah, it looks like the other one is about stuff we got going. Yeah, so we're going to be doing these every other Thursday, kind of rotating topics. Next one is on a kind of a backcountry 101. Then we've got Matt Cornell coming in to talk about some ice climbing around the Bozeman area. And so that stuff's all available on our website, Uphill Pursuits. Check our Instagram account. And we'll be partnering with the friends that are doing some actual avalanche awareness courses via kind of the virtual format as well. So stay tuned. We'll keep posted on that kind of stuff. And yeah, check the Friends of the Avalanche Center and the Avalanche Center website. And a big thanks to Doug for being here and doing this forecaster chat style, kind of opening it up to you guys. And then as well, the powder blast didn't happen this year. And so the opportunity for the friends to raise money didn't quite happen the way it normally was. So put a plug in. These guys do awesome work, and they give a lot of information for us that like to frequent the backcountry. So go ahead and get on there and donate if you can, even if it's just $1. $1 is an awesome value for the amount of forecasting that they do. If you can afford more, donate more. If $1 is all you can do, if you can't, don't worry about it. Do it at some point in the future, but I just want to put that plug in. So again, big thanks to Doug. Big thanks to everybody that came tonight. If your questions didn't get answered, I know there were a couple earlier on. We'll pull those off and I'll get them to Doug so we can get answers, and we'll post them on our Instagram account just to keep that conversation going. So awesome. Everybody, have a great night. Doug?
All right. I just want to thank everyone. Really be safe out there, especially early season like we are. We're only a few days out from a fatality. It was not avalanche related, but it's trauma related and from someone skiing. And it's if you're going to get out and you're going to ski some couloirs and you want to get up into the high country, obviously carry all your rescue gear, treat it like it's the middle of winter, but be aware that something simple like tipping over in early November is different than tipping over in February, because you've got rocks and logs and everything waiting to take out. So anyway, we're going to see a lot of people in the backcountry this year, and that's a lot of triggers. And just be careful that you don't have people below you as you're skiing, and as you're skinning up, just be extra careful about where you are in relation to other folks. But have fun out there, and hopefully we'll see you outside.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. And one last plug, if you need Avi gear, you have questions about it, come on into the shop. We've got beacon shovels, probes, airbags, everything that you need. So
right on. Yeah, thanks Bill for loving this.
Yeah. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Thanks, Doug.
All right.